Service. She testified to Congress.
Her husband died in 9/11.
Right. No, her husband died in a crash with Ron Brown in the former Yugoslavia. Right. He was on that plane with Ron Brown.
The former Commerce Secretary.
That's right. She testified to Congress in November 1993, trying to persuade them to pass NAFTA. And here's what she said. I'll just read this. It's a quote. Responding to the likely short to medium term impacts of NAFTA will require strengthening our enforcement efforts along the border. In other words, she's saying the liberalization of Mexico's economy would increase migratory pressures among those displaced in the name of economic efficiency. And most profoundly, this has been felt in the rural sectors. A few years ago, the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, a team of researchers associated with the Carnegie Endowment, did a study. And what they found was that between the years 1994 and 2002, about 1.3 million Mexican farmers or farm laborers had been displaced by a trade deficit that had been brought about most significantly by NAFTA. Right? So that's 1.3 million people and their dependents who have been displaced by NAFTA and the larger process of neoliberalization which it represents. Where do these people go? Well, they might try to go to Mexican cities, but the promise of NAFTA to greatly increase industrialization in Mexico never materialized. To the extent it materialized anywhere, it was in the border regions, but it didn't materialize sufficiently. And at the same time, of course, many of these maquiladoras, the factories, are moving to China, so they end up coming to places like New York City, Oakland, California, or rural areas of Wisconsin.
Let me ask you, there's an interesting piece by Nina Easton in Fortune, Obama, NAFTA, not so bad after all. The Democratic nominee in an interview with Fortune says he wants free trade to work for all people. She writes, a general campaign is on, independent voters are up for grabs, and Barack Obama is toning down his populist rhetoric, at least when it comes to free trade. She goes on to say, in an interview with Fortune to upcoming issue, the presumptive Democratic nominee backed off his harshest attacks on the free trade agreement and indicated he didn't want to unilaterally reopen negotiations on NAFTA. Sometimes during campaigns, the rhetoric gets overheated and amplified, he conceded, after I reminded him he had called NAFTA devastating and a big mistake, despite nonpartisan studies concluding the trade zone has had a mild positive effect on the U.S. economy. Does that mean Obama's rhetoric was overheated and amplified? He answered, politicians are always guilty of that, and I don't exempt myself. Obama says he believes in opening up a dialogue with trading partners, Canada and Mexico, and, quote, figuring to how we can make this work for all people.
Yeah, it's disappointing and at the same time hardly surprising. I mean, he's ambivalent and ambiguous on a number of issues. So, for example, Obama says he's against the war. In fact, he voiced opposition to the war prior to entering the U.S. Senate, but he's refused to vote against funding for the war. So what does that say effectively about his opposition to the Iraq war? Similarly, around NAFTA, during the campaign, as you pointed out, he made some strong statements critical of the agreement. Now he's somewhat backtracking. So this is an area of concern. At the same time, he has shown himself to be far better than, say, John McCain, who is one of the most sort of resolute so-called free traders in the Senate. Senator Obama, for example, voted against DR-CAFTA, the Dominican Republic Central American Free Trade Agreement. On the other hand, in terms of the free trade agreement with Oman, he was in favor of that. So his position is open to contestation. But I think
McCain on immigration in Arizona, where he is the senator?
Well, I mean, generally speaking, McCain, I mean, he says one thing around immigration. He presents himself as a moderate, and too many elements of the media are overly compliant in going along with that representation. The reality is something far different. I mean, if you look at McCain's website, for example, on immigration and boundary enforcement, he presents the issue purely in national security terms.
Let's talk about that word security and how it's been used since 9/11 in referring to the border between Mexico and the United States.
Well, security it's a user-friendly term. I mean, in the sense that it means almost anything to anyone, depending on who's employing it. And in the case of the U.S.-Mexico boundary, security has become the excuse for almost anything, right? while the term security was used prior to 9/11 to justify the buildup that began, for example, under the Clinton administration in 1994, 1995, it's been employed to a far greater extent over the last few years. And so today, if you go to the U.S. Border Patrol's website, for example, the first thing they talk about, right, in terms of what their mission is to fight terrorism, right? Now, what terrorists are crossing the U.S.-Mexico boundary? There's not been a single so-called terrorist caught crossing the U.S.-Mexico boundary before or after 9/11, right? So that begs the question, what is the U.S. Border Patrol doing, right? Well, the U.S. Border Patrol and the larger system, the larger Department of Homeland Security, of which the Border Patrol is now a part, are basically about, what they're about is catching, for the most part, people who are looking for jobs, people who are trying to rejoin their families. And if I could just read one quote from the book. This came from an article from Reason magazine, and it has this incredible quote from a U.S. Border Patrol agent, a Border Patrol agent who, by the way, is a media spokesperson. So he's been trained by the U.S. Border Patrol to present the best face. And here's what he said to a reporter last year, quote, "We're fortunate enough to be a country where there are lots of opportunities, and most of the people who we run into out here want to make that dream happen. Unfortunately, it's our job to stop that dream. That's what we do on an everyday basis." Right? So on the one hand, the Border Patrol is saying we're all about security, we're fighting terrorism. On the other hand, when you talk to the actual Border Patrol agents, I mean, some of them buy into that rhetoric of security, but a lot of them understand in a very deep way what they were actually doing, right? And that is helping to deny people basic human rights, as this Border Patrol agent so eloquently said.
Continuing on electoral politics, both McCain and Barack Obama have voted to build the 700-mile wall along the U.S.-Mexican border. That's right. And at the same time, Senator Obama has flip-flopped a bit on that in saying, well, he's not so sure if he wants to build a Berlin-type wall in there or something like a virtual fence. But what he does agree with Senator McCain, and which is sort of and this is sort of the consensus across the Democrat-Republican spectrum, is that more security is needed. To the extent there's a debate around immigration control and border control in the Congress, it's one over how many additional Border Patrol agents should we have, how many miles of fences and walls should we have. It's not calling into question the basic war on immigrants that's been taking place over the last few decades. Do you see a difference between Democrats and Republicans overall? Democratic administrations, Republican from Carter on to Reagan and to Bush and to Clinton and to Bush again. Well, what activists and people like Timothy Dunn, a sociologist who wrote a great book on the U.S.-Mexico border called The Militarization of the U.S.-Mexico Border, have pointed out is that the militarization really began under Jimmy Carter, right? A Democrat. And the great intensification that we saw in the beginning of the mid-90s began under the Clinton administration. Right? In that sense, we don't really see, I mean, there's a strong consensus between the two political parties. That said, at the margins, there are some differences. So in the case of Senator Barack Obama, he's been critical of a lot of the raids. Right? He wants to see family reunification being more important, have greater importance in the U.S. immigration regime. I think we'd see a reduction in workplace raids and things of that sort. But overall, I think he would continue, as would the Democrats as a whole, would continue the war that we've been seeing. And the role of the media, people like Lou Dobbs, who is fiercely opposed to these so-called free trade agreements, NAFTA, but also extremely harsh when it comes to, well, what they call illegal aliens. Right. Well, I mean, the role of people like Lou Dobbs has been devastating in terms of the basic human rights of migrants across the world, and specifically along the U.S.-Mexico border. I mean, his show is basically a show about a war on migrants, right? Despite his rhetoric when he comes on shows like Democracy Now! And says things to the contrary, he's played arguably the most important role of any single individual in the last few years in helping to fuel this criminalization, this marginalization, this really regime of terror that's been imposed on immigrant communities and border communities across the United States. What do you think has to happen, Joe Nevins? Well, I think we need a fundamental rethinking of the basic assumptions that underlie how we think about migrants, how we think about the U.S.-Mexico border and our relations between the United States and Mexico and the rest of the world. As long as there's a place called the United States and a place called Mexico, there's going to be a boundary between those two places. That's a given. What's not a given is the nature of that boundary. That boundary can be a line of life or it can be a line of death. Right? It can be a line of inclusion, a line of connection and negotiation, or it can be a line of exclusion. You know, in
in Nogales, Arizona, there's a wall between Nogales, Arizona and Nogales, Sonora, Mexico. And on the Mexican side of the wall, there's some graffiti. And it says something to the effect, if you turn this wall on its side, it becomes a bridge. If you turn this wall on its side, it becomes a bridge, right? I think the goal of the immigrant and human rights community and border rights community has to be to turn these boundaries into walls, excuse me, into bridges, not walls. And that entails, in the long run, a radical rethinking of our vision of how we relate to immigrants. And at the fundamental core of this has to be a basic right to mobility and residence for all peoples, regardless of where they're from.
Joe Nevins, I want to thank you for being with us on World Refugee Day. His book is called Dying to Live, a story of U.S. immigration in an age of global apartheid. Joe Nevins is a professor at Vassar here in New York, Vassar College. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. When we come back, we speak with an Iraqi immigrant, an Iraqi refugee, one of fewer than 5,000 who